Good evening, everyone. I am Adnan Aamir, and tonight, this is the first episode of my show, Live with Adnan Aamir. And this is a new idea that I am starting for the first time, and it's first time I'm going live and live streaming my show. So, Live with Adnan Aamir will be broadcasted every Saturday from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. And we will try to cover the latest issues, but our focus will be on Belt and Road, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, politics, economy, and development. And we will also, in Pakistan, we will also try to cover the national level issues, the politics and economy, and with a focus on Balochistan. So, and today is 8th of August, and this day is special for Balochistan because four years ago on this day, there was a devastating suicide blast in Civil Hospital Quetta, and an entire generation of lawyers was wiped out. 56 lawyers were killed, and according to a senior lawyer, Balochistan cannot fulfill this deficiency for the next 25 years to come. So among those 56 lawyers, there were a few that were my personal friends. So I just want to remember them that they lost their lives in a volatile place like Balochistan. And we hope that the peace prevails here and a devastating tragedy like this does not happen again. So now we start the program and we start the program. And so our today's program is about, the topic is, where is CPEC added? As you know, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor initiated during the government of PMLN in April 2015. The agreements were signed between Pakistan and China, and it was initially called the game changer by Nawaz Sharif, and arguably it has been the single most discussed subject on Pakistani media. And it is again taking pace, it is again gaining pace, and that's why we want to discuss it. And to discuss this topic, we have a very, I would say, active and proactive guest, Mr. Michael Kugelman, who is the Deputy Director of Asia Program at Wilson Center and also South Asian Associate. He's an expert on India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and he has edited and co-edited 11 books, and we read his analysis in many newspapers, including Foreign Policy and New York Times. And I can say that arguably he is one of the most quoted and cited experts on Pakistan. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you. Appreciate the kind introduction, and it's an honor to be your first guest.
Thank you. So we will start the show formally, and I'll start asking you the questions. So before we just dive deep into CPEC and all the things that are happening, I just want to know a little bit about you, and our viewers also want to know, because I see you are very active on Twitter tweeting about Pakistan, and there are people like who say, Michael, please do not interfere in matters of our country, or just go back to USA and things like this. So for people in Pakistan, just please tell us briefly, who is Michael Kugelman?
Sure. Yeah, well, by way of introduction, I've been at the Woodrow Wilson Center, a major think tank in DC, for 15 years and 13 years in the current role. So I've been managing our South Asia portfolio for 13 of those 15 years. And, you know, actually, there was a moment in graduate school when I took a class on South Asia, really on a whim. It was a class on Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. And it was when I took that class that I first realized, gee, this is a region that I really want to make a career out of, because I actually had initially planned to study the Middle East. I graduated college right around the time of the 9/11 attacks and then the war in Iraq. And so I wanted to study the Middle East. But when I got to graduate school and took that class on South Asia on a whim, I essentially decided to redirect at that point. And that's basically how I got to where I am now, interfering in Pakistan. No. It is my job, because that's what I'm supposed to do, is to study the region, certainly U.S. relations with Pakistan and the broader region, but also domestic affairs, the very fascinating domestic affairs in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India.
Nice. And I think you are among the few experts who have the distinction, or who have the accomplishment that they have been blamed to work for several intelligence agencies. So you must be really good at your job if so many intelligence agencies have hired you, according to the Twitter trolls.
It must mean I'm doing something right. That's all I can say.
Right. So now again, so like we just start on our topic. So as you must be following that, like in last 2 days there has been a spat between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. Shah Mahmood Qureshi, the foreign minister of Pakistan, he just gave a very statement against Saudi Arabia, which was, I would say, unfriendly and like unprecedented, because normally the Pakistani ministers are very careful about Saudi Arabia, and he just like in a way gives signal like if Saudi Arabia does not like take the issue of Kashmir seriously, then Pakistan will side with Turkey and Malaysia in forming another block of Muslim countries, another pressure group. And while these things are happening, in the backdrop, like Pakistan has returned $1 billion in loans to Saudi Arabia, and there are reports that Saudi Arabia is like pulling back its financial support to Pakistan. And when Pakistan repaid this 1 billion to Saudi Arabia, so how do you see this spat between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and how China fits into this foray?
Well, yeah, this is a really big story. I mean, as you note, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have a very significant relationship that goes back many years, and it's sort of striking to all of a sudden hear the foreign minister harshly criticizing a Saudi-led group, the OIC. I think there's several factors at play here. One is the fact that I think Pakistan is genuinely unhappy and frustrated about Saudi Arabia's position on Kashmir. Pakistan perceives that the Saudis have really not been particularly vocal and critical of India in terms of what it's done in Kashmir since the revocation of the special status of Jammu and Kashmir a year ago. And that's an accurate perception in the sense that the Saudis have been very quiet, but much of the world has been very quiet. I'd argue that Pakistan has really struggled to get the world to take its side. At any rate, I think that that's some key backdrop that we have to think about as well. Some other things to keep in mind here in terms of context. The Saudis have been quietly scaling up their relations with India at the same time that India has been scaling back its relations with Iran, Saudi's rival, particularly because of the US sanctions regime on Iran, which has made it difficult for India to do energy trade with Iran. Iran had been a key Indian trade partner. I think we also have to look at this emerging Iran-China deal, and perhaps that suggests that Pakistan would want to try to position itself in a way that it would be less pro-Saudi in that rivalry between Saudi Arabia, and Iran. So there's a lot going on here, and if you could argue that if China and Iran have this emerging axis, that China may expect that Pakistan would move a bit closer to Iran, or at least make itself less overtly pro-Saudi Arabia in that rivalry. So it's very complicated, but it's a really significant thing, and this is not something that happens very frequently at all for a senior Pakistani official to be so publicly critical of such a key partner of the Pakistanis for so many years.
Okay, so like now there are two questions that are coming in my mind related to this. First of all, now that Saudi, like 2 years back, when Saudi Arabia announced this $6 billion support for Pakistan, then Prince MBS also visited Pakistan and he pledged like $10 billion in investments, and there was a oil refinery planned in Gwadar, which was like in the same city as the Gwadar port. And so there were some concerns that like a large Saudi, like a base or like facilities or investment near Iranian border can sabotage Pak-Iran relations. And then it was seen as like, at that time it was seen as like Gwadar was the competitor of Chabahar. But now with Saudis gone, and as you mentioned, Iran, China getting closer, and like there are talks about that $400 billion like agreements, like nothing is confirmed yet. But do you see like Saudis going away, and Iran coming into the foray, that this will benefit CPEC as Iran can start helping Pakistan? There will no longer be like a competition between Gwadar and Chabahar, and the Baloch insurgents who like allegedly use Iran to attack like the Makran coast, they can also be stopped. Do you see a positive change for Pakistan?
Yeah, I actually
due to this
do.
development?
Yes, I mean, I know that some observers have suggested that this China-Iran deal could undermine CPEC just because China could be more inclined to redirect infrastructure focus away from Pakistan and over to Iran, particularly with Pakistan being in this economic crisis that's been exacerbated by the pandemic and all that. But I don't necessarily see it that way at all. I think that China wants to essentially expand, well, it wants to expand the broader Belt and Road Initiative by bringing in more key players like Iran. But I think that you could also envision some type of broader role. How the contours of this would play out is unclear yet, in which Iran can contribute to CPEC. I mean, that's been discussed for quite some time. It seems like ever since CPEC was launched, there's always several countries that are repeatedly thrown out there as potential players that could join that project. Turkey and Iran certainly are top of those lists. Afghanistan you hear as well, but that's obviously a different story. We're not in a position to, that's not going to happen so long as the war is raging there. But I think it's it makes sense to think about Iran being brought into this. And again, everything is very preliminary now. Still struggling to figure out what the details are of this new China-Iran arrangement. But I certainly see it as something that could benefit Pakistan and benefit CPEC, particularly with Pakistan seemingly making maneuvers that suggest that it could be trying to strengthen its relationship with Iran at a moment when it's not necessarily backing away from Saudi Arabia, but it does not want to be as overtly associated as pro-Saudi or aligned with Saudi Arabia vis-a-vis the Saudi Arabia-Iran rivalry.
Okay. So, like in the backdrop of this Saudi-Pakistani spat. So, as I mentioned earlier, that now Pakistan is once again borrowed money from China to repay Saudi Arabia. And like if we assume that the $6 billion like the financial support Pakistan was getting, it's gone. So the Pakistan's reliance on China will increase. So do you see a situation where like China getting more influence in Pakistan because now they have to lend more money, and as a result they can have more leverage in taking asking Pakistan to take decisions which are like in their interest?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that China has always had a strong degree of influence in Pakistan, and that predates the CPEC days. As you know, this is a relationship that goes back quite some time. But I would argue that once CPEC came into the fold, I think that's made it, that inherently involves China being literally more present in Pakistan in terms of, laborers, workers, Chinese assets, Chinese capital, Chinese technology, all of that. And, we've seen for quite a few years that, China enjoys a fair amount of leverage and really can get away with a lot in Pakistan that many countries that would not. And, an example I like to use is a few years ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, there was a case of some Chinese laborers that actually started attacking Pakistani police because, as I understand it, they were not allowed to leave their area, their base, in order to go downtown to have some fun. And they got angry, and they actually had bats or sticks, and they were beating them on police cars. Now, nothing happened to them. And, if these were people from any other country, there would have been a lot of problems for them. But nothing happened to these Chinese workers, as I understand it. So China gets away with a lot in Pakistan that most countries do not. But
no, just if I remember correctly, the person who was involved with this study was ultimately deported to China.
Oh, is that right? Okay, well, but I think it took some time. At any rate, there's a level of impunity. There's a level of impunity that China can enjoy. At any rate, I think that Pakistan is a country that is not in a position to try to disassociate itself from China, and CPEC will continue to be a priority for Pakistan. Several months ago, before the pandemic set in, the two sides announced the second phase of this of CPEC, and the signaling from both sides, despite the pandemic, is that it's full speed ahead with CPEC. There is this rail upgrade project that was announced not too long ago under CPEC, and then of course there was a new project announced, several new projects announced in Pakistan administered Kashmir. And I think that ever since the U.S. came out and publicly criticized CPEC for the very first time, you'll remember this, when Alice Wells, then the senior-most U.S. South Asia-focused official at the State Department, she spoke at the Wilson Center, where I work. And for the first time, you had a senior official essentially criticize very heavily China's investment models and the way that it does business, and by extension, CPEC. It was a China-focused critique. It was not a Pakistan-focused critique, and it was essentially a case of Pakistan and CPEC getting caught up in the US-China rivalry. But I think after the US came out and publicly criticized CPEC for the first time, that made it very difficult, I think, for Pakistan to sort of distance itself, because the optics of Pakistan trying to back out and back away from CPEC after the US has come out and publicly condemned it, that would not play well in any context. So we see that it's essentially been full speed ahead. I imagine that a number of projects have been delayed and will continue to be delayed and slowed down due to the pandemic and Pakistan's economic concerns. It's increasingly risky, I think, for Pakistan to commit to new investments from CPEC, from China, just because it had this significant debt crisis before the pandemic set in, and its economic situation is in a very precarious spot right now. So CPEC, in effect, gives China a lot of leverage over Pakistan. And so long as you have that project in place, I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. That will ensure that China continues to have influence and leverage, even with some of these other interesting dynamics, with Pakistan perhaps trying to redirect or realign its relationship with Saudi Arabia. I think its relationship with China remains quite strong and is fairly consistent, fairly rock solid, I would say.
Okay, so now just talking a little bit more about this, like China-Iran deal. So lately, when this news was broken by New York Times and uh, there were like a lot of articles on it, but still like there are some people, like I was talking to an expert today and he was saying that this entire like China-Iran $400 billion, it's like complete, like it's a baloney, it's nothing like this, it's just propaganda and the numbers do not match up, because if like the $400 billion deal is happening, then it will it will eclipse CPEC and it will be the bigger project of BRI. So like, what is your take on this matter? Is this like this $400 billion thing, this is just Iran just spreading this news to signal USA and Europeans that we have China, or do you see like there is some reality in this like proposed agreement?
Well, I mean, ultimately, I don't know for sure. I'm not on the inside, and I really don't know what the full extent of this deal is. I think that we need to be very careful in reporting these huge numbers. I mean, there's been controversy over CPEC money. It appears that the money actually involved and invested in CPEC has been significantly less than that 62 billion figure that we've heard for so long, $62 billion. So, with China and Iran, I really don't know. I think it makes sense that China would want to strike this deal. I mean, China is in it's affected a very assertive, muscular foreign policy that it itself describes as wolf warrior diplomacy, all about more aggressively pursuing its interests overseas. And clearly, BRI is one of its core, building out BRI is one of its core strategic interests globally. And so naturally, it would envision Iran as a key player in that regard, not just because of opportunities with Chabahar and things like that, but Iran's general location. The geography of Iran makes it very important, hypothetically, in the Belt and Road Initiative. But as to whether that much money was involved, as has been reporting, that I don't know, and we'll just have to see how that plays out.
Right. So now if we just pivot a little bit to the issue of Kashmir. As you know, like when there were like these Indo-China clashes in the Galwan Valley and in the like Ladakh region, during the same period, China signed a lot of projects in the Pakistani controlled Kashmir. First, like there was the Amir Basha Dam, which is in the Gilgit-Baltistan region of Pakistan, and then there were two other hydropower projects which were signed in the Azad and Jammu Kashmir, the Pakistani controlled Kashmir. So like these projects were already in the pipeline, but their agreements were specifically signed like a few weeks after those Indo-China clashes. So do you see like this Kashmir factor, like China is like trying to like signal India that China is also supporting Pakistan on Kashmir because of its interest in CPEC?
Yeah, no, I do think we have to keep the Kashmir factor in mind here. I mean, as you know, the main reason why India rejects the Belt and Road Initiative is because of CPEC. India has never come out and condemned BRI across the board, but it's CPEC that it opposes, and the reason for that is that CPEC is envisioned to go through territory that India claims, and I think that what we see here is essentially Pakistan and China trying to push back against that Indian position, in which you have Beijing and Islamabad saying, well, look, we really don't care. We're going to continue to build this project out. And this is Pakistani territory. Why should you even be concerned? So, yes, I think that if there were, I mean, there were already plenty of incentives for Pakistan and China to do CPEC work in, in Pakistan-administered Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan, just because this is key geography and this is key real estate when it comes to CPEC and BRI. But now that you have the India-China clashes and the India-China relationship has sunk to such a low level, that clearly is an added incentive for China to push back, for Pakistan to push back against India.
Right. So coming back to the same Indo-China clashes, like all this happened very suddenly, and there were like very aggressive moves by the China. But like there is one line of thought, or there's one school of thought. There are people who just believe, who just claim that everything that China did basically was to signal India, so that it pulls back its aggressive stance on Kashmir. Because as you know, like after 5th of August last year, India was like, they were very aggressive, and they were saying that now that we have like taken control, like we have like made Indian controlled Kashmir a part of India, now we will go for Pakistani Kashmir and for Exai. And so like there was like direct threat to CPEC, or to Belt and Road Initiative for that matter. So like, do you also agree with this of thought, whatever China did, that was basically to protect BRI, or in turn CPEC?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think that we may never know the main reason why China decided to stage the provocations that it did in Ladakh that sparked its latest and very serious India-China border standoff. I think that the proximate cause, I think you can imagine, was India's completion of this major and very long and strategic border road, which stretches all the way from Leh, the capital of Ladakh, all the way near the Karakoram Pass. And that's very troubling for China for clear reasons. But the fact of the matter is, there have been so many of these India-China border spats over the years since they fought their war in the 1960s. And many times the proximate cause is road building. But typically, when you have these border spats, they're not as serious and not as violent, and certainly not as deadly as this current one is. And that, to me, amplifies that it's not just the road building issue. It's not just the infrastructure building issue that compelled China to act in the way it did this time. I do think that the revocation of Article 370 played a role. It wasn't the only reason, but it did play a role. I mean, very soon after India made that move, the Chinese Foreign Ministry condemned it. I think the very next day, it condemned the move very loudly with some strongly worded language. Amit Shah, the Interior Minister of India, the day after the repeal of Article 370, he made a speech in Parliament in which he basically said that Aksai Chin is ours, and Aksai Chin, of course, is the part of Ladakh that China controls. And then you had India release several months later, the government in India releasing new maps depicting a map of India after the Article 370 revocation, which China, of course, rejected. Keeping in mind, of course, that we think that many of us think about the repeal of Article 370 and we think of what it did to Jammu and Kashmir, but it also reorganized Ladakh into a formal union territory of India. And that's what got China so unhappy. So I think that there's reason to think that those moves by India, which China perceived as something that directly threatened territory that it claims on some levels, that was one reason why it decided to act as robustly and vociferously as it did in its provocations that launched the current crisis. And yes, BRI or CPEC, it does envision using or being based on territory that is contested, that it's disputed, that India claims, that Pakistan controls. So that all comes into the picture here when trying to figure out why China did what it did in Ladakh. And there's several other reasons as well, of course, like this increasingly assertive policy on the part of China that's seen it, not just stage these multiple incursions along the line of actual control, but also increasingly aggressive behavior in the South China Sea, some things it's done in Hong Kong, and so on. China probably wanted to extend that to Ladakh. And at a time of the global pandemic, when it's been getting a lot of criticism for how it handled the virus initially, it's been wanting to respond with some tough messages. So that's all at play too. But I do think that we have to consider the Kashmir factor, and by extension BRI, CPEC, in the trying to understand why China acted when it did and in the way that it did in Ladakh.
Okay, so now that the China acted like in a very aggressive posture, do you think like this will now make India a bit more cautious about its approach of opposing CPEC or BRI, or it will further provoke them to even oppose them even more vehemently?
Well, I mean, given the nature of the India-China relationship right now, it hasn't been this bad for several decades. The last thing India is going to want to do is back away and change its position on BRI. I think it's going to continue to be very hostile in opposition to it. But I do think we have to separate the rhetoric from the reality. One thing that Pakistan is really worried about for a long time is this, what appears to be an increasing frequency of threats, verbal threats from the Modi government to reclaim Pakistan-administered Kashmir, Gilgit-Baltistan. These are not new threats, but the frequency and intensity with which they've been made for a number of months is something that's concerned many in Pakistan. Does that mean that, given how bad the India-China relationship is, that India would try to do something, so to speak? No, I don't think so at all. So I think we have to separate the rhetoric and the threats, which will continue, and what would actually happen on the ground. I think is a bit different. But no, I really don't see India wanting to do anything that would suggest that it's going to be more sort of receptive and deferential to the Belt and Road Initiative, especially with China having expanded its presence and influence throughout South Asia because of BRI over the last few years. I think that's something that really concerns India and something that it's not going to settle for. You look at Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and even places like Nepal and Bhutan. Because of the Belt and Road Initiative, China has been able to make more inroads there. And it's very concerning to India, particularly in the case of some of these countries that have really been very close traditional friends of India's, Nepal and Bhutan. India has struggled with a lot of countries in South Asia, Bangladesh for one, but Nepal and Bhutan, those had been very close friends for quite some time. And now, of course, India is embroiled in a border spat with Nepal. And meanwhile, China staged a provocation in the Doklam Plateau several years ago in territory that India and Bhutan think is Bhutanese. China was trying to test India. It has been trying to test India in its major spheres of influence. And that's, I think, very concerning to India and will sort of exacerbate these concerns of some within the Indian security establishment that China is encircling India. This notion of the string of pearls. These are terms that go back a number of years. But given what China's doing now through the main vehicle of BRI, it's only going to heighten those fears even more.
And recently, there has also been a thaw in relations between Pakistan and Bangladesh, and the prime ministers of the both country have talked on phone, and Bangladesh is now making these moves because of its problems with India. So that can also factor in this entire scenario.
Absolutely. No, I think that Pakistan is wisely capitalizing on India's struggles in its neighborhood. And indeed, you have some tensions in the India-Bangladesh relationship, one that really strengthened significantly in the Modi years. And of course, the tensions go to this because of this citizenship law in India, which has caused concern in Bangladesh. Islamabad knows that. I think it sought an opening to try to reach out to Bangladesh, and I think the government in Pakistan was wise to do that. Now, take a long time before you can talk about a reset, much less a normalization in relations between Bangladesh and Pakistan. But I think that it sensed an opportunity. Perhaps Beijing was encouraging Pakistan to act in that regard as well. But it makes sense, and we could see Pakistan try to do that with other countries where India is struggling, whether you're talking about Nepal or other countries as well. So I think that there is an opportunity here for Pakistan, and we'll see how far it goes in trying to capitalize.
Okay, so let's shift gears towards the internal security of CPEC. And lately, there have been a security challenge to CPEC coming from largely from the Baloch separatists. Like they have carried out many low scale attacks on Chinese that have not caused like a lot of damage, but like they have signaled that CPEC is not safe, and they have released videos in which they have warned President Xi of China to leave Balochistan, otherwise they will continue attacks. And recently there was an attack on Karachi Stock Exchange, Pakistan Stock Exchange in Karachi, where Chinese companies have like a significant stake. And recently, one of the very less known Sindhi separatist organizations known as Sindhu Desh Revolutionary Army, they have like formed an alliance with a consortium of Baloch separatist brass, and now together like they have vowed to attack the Chinese interest in Pakistan. So how do you see this new alliance? Like, how is it going to affect the CPEC, its progress, or like the security dynamics of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So far as I know, this is really the first time you've had something resembling a formal alliance between anti-state separatists in both Baluchistan and Sindh. The notion of an interprovincial alliance against the state, that's to me new and should be of concern to the government. However, I don't think we should overstate the threat posed by these separatists. I mean, indeed, the BLA, the Baluchistan Liberation Army, the main separatist militant group in Baluchistan, it has been it staged several attacks, including some pretty significant ones. And it certainly is not something that should be disregarded. But you know, it's not a huge threat. We're not talking about Pakistani Taliban level threats to the state. And you know, you could certainly criticize the way in which the Pakistanis have tried to suppress the insurgency in Baluchistan, but it's really degraded the capacities of the likes of BLA. So we shouldn't overstate that. And in terms of these Sindh, these Sindh militants, there's always been a latent threat of Sindhi militancy, but so far as we know, there's not all that much there. However, I think the big question comes, maybe you were going to ask me this anyway, the notion of external support. And I think this is an important point to bring up here. As you know, Pakistan has long accused India of providing support to these very types of groups, Baluch groups that oppose the Pakistani state. You know, you look at the dynamics of the India-Pakistan-China relationship. You look at what's happened with the India-China relationship. You look at how India has been struggling, in effect, to really retaliate against China because of its relatively limited military capacities. India is not in a position to retaliate militarily against India. So you could argue that perhaps India would want to look at you know, some of these groups in Pakistan as potential proxies to provide covert support to retaliate against China by encouraging these groups to stage attacks on Chinese interests in Pakistan. Now, I know that Pakistani officialdom is 2,000% sure that this is exactly what's happening. I'm not sure I'm in a position to say that, but certainly given the way the dynamics are now, it's certainly something to look at and to be concerned about. And if these groups are getting external support, even if they're relatively modest in terms of their capacities, if they do get some degree of external support, that can be very helpful. But final point here, I would argue that China has shown that it's willing to take a lot of risk, that it is willing to continue to do investments in areas that are experiencing security troubles. You know, you look at some of China's broader investments overseas in places like Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. There have been these large-scale agricultural investments on the part of China. There have been violence that's taken place, including, you know, the violence that targets these Chinese investments. That hasn't really compelled them to leave. So I do think China will have a lot of it'll be willing to take risks, and it knows that at the end of the day, the Pakistani military will be there to provide whatever types of support it would want. And I think the fact that the Chinese consulate, as you noted before, was attacked by the BLA, and yet the Chinese, you know, they stayed there. They didn't do anything. That's very telling. The Chinese government was attacked in Pakistan by a terror group, and the Chinese, you know, I think they were concerned behind the scenes. I'm sure that they were telling Pakistan they need to do a better job of providing security, but they didn't leave. And I think that's significant. So I do think, and I'll end here, for China, if you're looking for a reason why China may become concerned about CPEC and we think its commitment to the project, it would take a lot to get to that. But I think it would come down to financial considerations more so than security considerations. If Pakistan gets too uncomfortable about taking on new loans because of its economic crisis, and China doesn't feel comfortable bringing in more, providing more money that it thinks may not be paid back, that's where I think you have to worry. But so long as these security threats remain on a low boil, I don't think that's necessarily going to impact China's thinking. But we'll see. I mean, we'll see if this new alliance of Sindhi and Baluch groups, if it manages to carry out more attacks, and if they happen with more frequency, if the casualty figures are significant, that's when you may have to be concerned. But I think that China would have a pretty large tolerance, large threshold before it would be compelled to withdraw, whereas the financial issue is a different story.
Okay, so another related question to this topic is that I believe it was last year when U.S. State Department designated BLA as a terrorist organization, and now apparently Pakistan is trying to designate BLA a terrorist organization in UN also, after their alliance and after their attacks on CPEC and on the stock exchange. So do you see this happening, and like will it matter or will it like affect anything? Like, for example, the US designation of like BLA as a terrorist organization, did it stop the organization, or how will this thing play out, like in terms of stopping the attacks on CPEC?
Yeah, well, I think one thing we see is when when these terror designations are made, it doesn't really necessarily impact the operations of these groups. And you look at some of these Pakistani groups, these India-focused groups, have they been impacted by designations for major global institutions or the U.S. government? Not necessarily. Certainly, if there's a reputational element at play, and that in the case of basically, I'll put it this way: I don't think we should overstate the impact that these types of designations would have on the group's ability to perform. I mean, since the BLA was designated by the U.S. as a terror group, it's continued to carry out attacks. Certainly, if Pakistan succeeds with getting the BLA designated at the UN, and it may, given the power of China and so on there, that I think that would be a big boost to Pakistan's foreign policy. It would I think that the reputational impact there would be very significant. With Pakistan could say, well, look, one of these major threats to our state and to our territory, it's been formally recognized as a terror group, as it should be, by the wider international community. But Pakistan is already, the Pakistani military has really been going hard against very robustly going after the BLA and its partners for a number of years. So I don't necessarily see any sort of change there. I think that it's something that Pakistan would be happy to see if the UN designated it, but beyond that, I don't necessarily see that impacting the group's capacities and potential to carry out strikes.
Okay, right. So coming to the current status of CPEC, last year Pakistan formed the CPEC authority through an ordinance, and the purpose was to streamline all the activities on CPEC. But now that the duration of that ordinance has passed, so now they have to introduce a bill into the parliament to give the legal cover to the CPEC authority. And as you might have read in the government is trying to give a lot of power to the CPEC authority, that it will just it can penalize or it can punish any government official that is not following their orders or their instructions. And the newly proposed CPEC authority will trespass in the domain of the provincial governments, and the provincial governments are also not happy with it. So it's more like a Chinese model of centralization, and it's in the contradiction with the Pakistani model of where there is still a significant level of provincial autonomy. So do you think has Pakistan borrowed a page from a Chinese government system, or this is actively being pursued by China, and they want to have authority to facilitate the development on the CPEC?
Well, I'd like to hope that this development is deliberated robustly in the parliament. I'm not sure that will actually happen, but Yeah, I think to your question, a very simple answer. I think that it highlights two things that we've already discussed. One is how important CPEC is for Pakistan, that it's willing to take these steps to make this authority more powerful. And two, the influence of China. Indeed, I mean, this model that it seems to be following does sound a lot like the Chinese model, for sure. And I think that that appears to be what we're seeing here.
Okay. And like yesterday, there was a webinar in Pakistan, and Chinese ambassador was like talking there, and I just heard him, and he was saying that the visit of President Xi Jinping to Pakistan this year is like still on the agenda, and as like when the time comes or there's an opportune time, he will visit. And we also are expecting the Joint Cooperation Committee meeting of CPEC this year. So, what do you see, like any major developments that can happen during the visit of Xi Jinping that can be like really significant, or like it is going to be business as usual? And how do you see the situation?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, it depends on when the visit happens, so it's hard to tell. It's hard to get a sense now as to what it could entail in terms of deliverables or whatever the case may be. I think one of the main objectives would be to really telegraph to a global audience the continued commitment that the two sides have to CPEC at a time when there has been some speculation that it could lose some momentum. Given these concerns on the part of Pakistanis about taking more and more loans, and particularly with this economic crisis and the pandemic, which has delivered a considerable shock to the Pakistan's economy, though we don't yet know the full extent of what that shock will be. So I imagine that if you have this visit, you'd have the leaders coming out there and stating very emphatically that we look forward to this partnership with CPEC, and we're going to CPEC, and we're going to continue to build it out. I think that would really be one of the major objectives, is just to emphasize how committed the two sides still are to it. But it's I think until we have a better sense as to when that visit will happen, it's sort of hard to gauge what exactly we could expect to come out of it.
Right. So now we just shift gears to another topic related to CPEC, and it's like also like related to your Wilson Center. Like it was not long ago, the former Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, Ambassador Alice Wells, like delivered a talk about CPEC in the Wilson Center. I think you moderated that talk, and in which it was like the first time she openly criticized CPEC and in very detail, and that was met with a very furious responses from both China and Pakistan. And later on, she also criticized CPEC time and time again. And Pakistan and China, like they have like not taken those words very kindly. So first of all, like what is the basis? Like what is the driving factor for US to criticize CPEC? And secondly, is this just criticism, or will also be like should take a shape of a policy?
Well, as I think I said before, Alice Wells' public critique of CPEC was more about China than it was about Pakistan. And as you know, the U.S.-China relationship has been worsening a lot. And even back in November of 2019, when she made that speech, the U.S.-China relationship was rapidly deteriorating. And the Trump administration is really trying to take a hard line on China. It's going to oppose anything that it's doing, and certainly something like CPEC, which entails significant levels of investment and influence building in a country, Pakistan, that is pretty significant for U.S. interests, for sure. So in that sense, it's sort of surprising that you didn't get that public critique sooner. But I do think many in Pakistan misunderstood her critique as something that was targeting Pakistan. It was not. And the first part of her speech, when she criticized CPEC, that was quoted heavily, got a lot of attention. There was much less media focus on the second part of her speech, when she actually called on there to be more U.S. investment in Pakistan, and she called for this alternative model, which basically was along the lines of what is ingrained in the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. An alternative model of investment that's less predatory and that actually provides benefits to those on the ground. It was a very aspirational idea, and naturally one should be skeptical of that type of comment, given that the U.S. can talk a good game about how infrastructure projects should be done in South and Central Asia, but the U.S. cannot hold a candle to what China has been able to do in terms of quantity, intensity of projects. China is so much more present in this region than the United States is. But at any rate, so to answer your question, the reason that speech came was that basically it was just CPEC getting caught up in the U.S.-China rivalry. That's what it comes down to. And I think that the U.S. is hoping that in time, though who knows when this will happen, the U.S. can align its relationship with Pakistan in a way that there could actually be more types of U.S. Investments in Pakistan. But a lot of question marks there. The U.S. government would not feel comfortable sort of focusing so much on that economic side of the relationship until Pakistan starts making significant adjustments to its investment environment. After U.S. troops have left Afghanistan, the U.S. frankly may struggle to muster a justification for continuing to engage on deep levels with Pakistan. But at any rate, I think that we have to look at that critique from Ambassador Wells as something very much focused on the U.S.-China rivalry. It was really not meant to be a verbal rhetorical attack on Pakistan. But naturally, Pakistani officials had to be critical of the talk of her critique, and they had to lambaste her and the U.S. for it, because if they didn't, China would not have been happy, for sure. So the optics of Pakistan not responding to an assault on CPEC, that's not something that could have happened.
Right. So as you said that CPEC was caught in the middle of a US-China rivalry. So is it possible that now that US-China rivalry is intensifying and there are US president is imposing tariffs on China, and now they are banning their apps and things like this. So is it possible, for instance, if, and there's a big if, Trump gets re-elected, and can CPEC or Pakistan be affected by US sanctions on China or anything like that? Like Pakistan or CPEC can be a direct casualty of sanctions or anything more serious?
Yeah, that's a good question, and a lot of big ifs there for sure. But at the end of the day, I don't know. I mean, if the U.S. were to sanction China and basically do something similar to what it's done with Iran, where it basically is pressuring countries not to do any business with China, would that deter Pakistan? I don't know. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion within the South Asia analyst community as to whether Pakistan will essentially want to throw in its lot with China and just divorce the United States after U.S. troops have left Afghanistan, that type of thing. I really do think Pakistan wants to have it both ways. I think that it certainly wants to maintain its relationship with China. I think it also wants to maintain its relationship with the United States. I think it sees value in its relationship with the United States for a number of reasons. But if Pakistan considered it significant enough, if given how important CPEC is for Pakistan, would Pakistan tell China to get lost if the U.S. is saying that no country should do business with China? No, I don't think that would happen at all. Pakistan is not going to push China away. It's not going to jeopardize CPEC just because of a hypothetical U.S. sanctions regime on China. At the end of the day, Pakistan's relationship with China is critical. But certainly, it would put Islamabad in a very difficult situation. And I imagine that you could have a scenario that could play out similar to what India was able to work out with the United States in the Iran context. India, at least for a brief period, got a waiver from the United States that allowed it to continue to do business with Iran, enabling it to sort of slowly and only modestly, but still nonetheless move forward on the Chabahar project for a brief period. So maybe Pakistan would look for some type of waiver, but I don't know. It's all a lot of hypotheticals for sure.
Okay, and another related question to this. So, as you already said, that Pakistan is caught between CPEC is caught between US-China rivalry, and Pakistan and Iran and China are getting closer, and China and India are again having clashes, and now Pakistan is also estranged with Saudi Arabia. So, and Saudis and Indians both are allies of US. So, do you there is Pakistan, Iran and China are taking posture against US, its allies, and their interests. And do you think, if I ask you briefly, can Pakistan afford to have this sort of conflict with US and its allies, given its reliance on the West and the Western institutions like IMF and everything?
I think Pakistan wants to have it always. It wants to certainly maintain its important relationship with China and the Saudis, for that example. But I think it wants to diversify. I think it wants to ensure that it has a number of key partners, and we're starting to see that already. We haven't really talked about this, but one thing that's notable, a very key element of Pakistan's foreign policy in recent years, are these efforts to reach out to broader U.S. rivals such as Turkey and Russia. There's been some significant growth in Pakistan's relationship with both of those countries. Turkey is significant because it has been much more fervently supportive of Pakistan's position on Kashmir than Saudi Arabia and many other Muslim majority countries have been. But no, you're right. I mean, Pakistan cannot afford any type of confrontation with the West. I think that it looks for support, economic partnerships with countries in the West, including the United States, even though it's oftentimes difficult for it to do that. We don't know what the U.S.-Pakistan relationship will look like after U.S. troops have left Afghanistan, but no, I think Pakistan wants to have it always. It wants to be able to continue to work with as many countries as it can, despite efforts by India to quote-unquote isolate Pakistan. I don't think it's a policy that's really worked.
Okay, so one final question on this topic. So now that U.S. troops are leaving Afghanistan and they are in a hurry, so what is the sense in Washington, in the policy circles that you are part of? What can be a possible U.S. approach to Pakistan? Would it be something similar to what happened in 1989, or this time U.S. will be a more receptive of Pakistan and its future utility?
Well, it's hard to say. The U.S. government is going to have to find a new anchor for its relationship with Pakistan. It's been Afghanistan for so many years, and I think one of the big questions is, what will the new anchor be? Can there be a new anchor? And I do think that trade and economics can be one thing. I mean, you have had senior U.S. officials talk about their desire for focusing on that part of the relationship. The U.S. does have this Indo-Pacific strategy, which stretches from quote Kilimanjaro to what is it? California, Kilimanjaro to California, according to a senior U.S. official. That suggests that the entire South Asia region is a part of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. So you could argue that the U.S. should continue to look at Pakistan as a relationship that it could pursue, infrastructure projects with and that type of thing. But as you know, I'm sure, Pakistan there's not a lot of love for Pakistan in Washington. There's a lot of mistrust. There's still a lot of unhappiness about what's happened, given what's happened in Afghanistan, given the bin Laden affair, that it's going to be very difficult, I think, for there to be strong political buy-in across the board here in Washington for a broader relationship with Pakistan after U.S. forces have left Afghanistan. So making the case for an economics-driven relationship makes sense on a number of levels, but the question is if senior policymakers really want to do that. Would U.S. policymakers really want to try to broaden its relationship with a country that is closely aligned with America's top strategic rival and arguably, according to Trump administration officials, America's top national security threat, that being China?
Okay, so yeah, so final question from my side, and then we will be having a couple of questions from the audience. So Pakistani authorities, they repeatedly say that the CPEC is a victim of propaganda. There are a lot of people who deliberately write and report against CPEC, and all the articles or all the breaking news about CPEC, they say it's a part of great disinformation campaign. And I'm sure you also write about CPEC, and also you also get to hear these comments on Twitter and from people in Pakistan. So can I briefly do you believe that the CPEC is receiving bad publicity for no reason, or there's some deliberate attempts to spread a negative propaganda about it, or that this impression is not correct?
No, I think this is just a case of Pakistan's widening crackdown on dissent, CPEC getting caught up in that. I think that's an indication of how important CPEC is for Pakistan. There are a number of red lines that the press really are not allowed to cross in Pakistan. One is criticism of the military and intelligence agencies, and I think CPEC is now in that category as well. There's been criticism of CPEC, and there should be. Now, to be sure, some commentary, some reportage is some of it is sloppier than other elements of it. There could be some reporting that's not right, for sure. But I think the broader critique that you hear, including in Pakistan, or at least when you're allowed to get that critique out there, is concerns about Pakistan taking on a prohibitively expensive project that it clearly is not benefiting the country on the whole in ways that it should be. The technology transfers are not being what they should be. The fact that you have so much imported Chinese labor into Pakistan raises questions about employment opportunities coming under CPEC, and the fact that marginalized communities, the Baluch among others, there's no clear indication yet that they are benefiting in ways that they should. I mean, these are reasonable critiques that are being made by many. And I think Alice Wells gave voice to these critiques as well. I don't see it as disinformation. I see it as criticism, and there's nothing wrong with that. But again, I do think that there could be some sloppy reporting for sure. I would acknowledge that. But broadly speaking, you've got some very credible, well-informed economists and others that have been making reasoned critiques of the project, and that's important in a democracy. In a true democracy, there should be that debate and discourse about the pros and cons of CPEC, what's promising about it, but also what's potentially troubling about it.
Okay, so now we have a couple of questions from our audience. So one of the audience member has asked a question that Pakistan has borrowed heavily from China for CPEC for these infrastructure projects. So do you think that Pakistan can capitalize on these projects, or will it be able to repay the loans back to China?
Yeah, see, this is the $400,000 question that I think I alluded to earlier. It's notable that when the current government in Pakistan first took office, there was some much publicized concern about the viability of taking on new CPEC loans, and you had a senior government minister who did an interview, I think, for the Financial Times, in which he basically says we need to pause things for a year or so. And there was a lot of pushback from his own government after that, suggesting that maybe that concern wasn't meant to get out there publicly. But I mean, I think it makes sense from the anti-corruption platform that that Imran Khan has always focused on. The notion of having all this money coming into Pakistan from China, all in opaque ways. Contracts have not been made public. It's unclear what's happening with this money, how it's being used. The terms of the contract have not been made public. So from an anti-corruption lens, it would make sense for the PTI to be concerned about that. But I do think that as the Army has solidified its control over wide degrees of public policy, including areas that are typically left to the civilians, like economic policy, I think the idea is that, well, no, we've got to right the ship and go full speed ahead on this. But I'm not an economist, but given the trend lines for Pakistan when it comes to its public debt and its broader debt concerns, I would think that there's reason to believe, especially in the context of the pandemic, that Pakistan will probably need to be a bit more cautious about how many new loans it takes in from China in the coming weeks and months, unless they're renegotiated in a way that would address Pakistan's concerns about these things. And I know that the IMF has also expressed concern about the way these loans have come in. So I don't have an answer as to whether, how far Pakistan could go with this. I do think that the concerns will remain in place on the part of Pakistan, but I think that it's not going to impact the viability of CPEC for the reasons I mentioned. I think that Islamabad will want to push ahead as much as it can and conclude that it can withstand the financial risks, at least for now.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much for being our guest on the very first episode. And you almost talked for almost 50 to 55 minutes on a topic like CPEC, which is itself a very challenging part. So thank you for being the guest, and we are looking forward to reading your analysis and listening to your interviews about CPEC in the days to come.
Well, thank you. It was a great discussion, and there's so much more we could have said as well. But thanks a lot. Great debate.
So that was our discussion with Michael Kugelman on our very first show. I hope you all liked it and it was very informative for you. So now our show time is over, and before going, I would like to request all our viewers to like our Facebook page and subscribe our YouTube channel, and also follow our Twitter account and help us improve spreading the content of our news show. Thank you very much and see you next week, 8 p.m. on Saturday. Goodbye.